Hi, I'm Llewellyn Falco, and I do a lot of open source. And on one of my projects, ApprovalTest.cpp, we have recently, over the last 2 months, been creating a lot of documentation, user-facing documentation. And in fact, because our DevOps is really solid in this project, we've gotten to the point that as part of our definition of done, it includes writing documentation. And we work in about half-hour to 2-hour cycles. And so about every half-hour to 2 hours of working, we are not only creating a feature, but we are creating documentation about that feature. And this has changed the way I develop, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit here. And just so you have an idea of where I started from, it used to have the opinion that the unit tests were the documentation, right? They showed how to use the code, they used the code, they exercised the code. But that opinion has changed. And before I even get to how it impacts me, I want to start with how it's different. Because I have noticed a shift in the way I develop that actually feels very similar to the type of step I took when I went from not writing tests at all to writing tests with test-driven development. And I feel like I'm making another shift as I've been making the documentation part of me writing the code. And the reason for that is when I was doing unit tests, it forced me to think about how I was going to use the code. It really expanded that empathy. The documentation has been changing my empathy yet again, not to how you use the code, but how you learn to use the code. And not only is that a different starting point, it's not even necessarily the same starting point. Different users can be starting from different places to learn to use your code. So you have to think not just from a single other place, but sometimes from multiple other places. We'll come back to this, but first let's look at just the fact that these things are different. So let's start with a simple example. This is coming from some code I wrote in Java, and we use something called MD snippets. I'll talk about that more at the end, but that's those comments that you see here. I'm going to take them away so you can see the code a little bit easier, but this is the unit test, and it does indeed tell a story. It sort of shows how things are being used. However, it's a little bit hard to read this and see the story. And I want you just to compare this to the documentation. And just notice how much easier this documentation is to consume. Sometimes we wish you could add an array the same way you could add to a list. Here's a list of numbers, and we add to the array. And this will result in a new copy of the array with the added items. It goes down easier. And I want to talk about how these are similar and different, but so let's put them side by side. And let's start by just removing things. So we got all these words here. These words don't mean anything. Sometimes, will, of the, items. These are just English words. I think of these almost as lubrication, and that they just make everything go down easier, but they don't actually provide any content, any value. And so let's just get rid of those. And then we can look at these. These are actually the name of the method, right? Add to array, right? Like these would be considered clutter in my code, and they definitely don't add anything that's not in the code itself. And then, of course, we have the examples, but these literally come from the code. And in fact, I mentioned that we're using MD snippets, so they literally come from the code. But even after we remove all of that, we're still left with these two pieces. And these two pieces are what's usually referred to as scaffolding, right? It is something you can build upon. In this case, it's a metaphor, something you're already familiar with. You've worked with lists. You've added things to lists. But it's different than a list. And here's how it's different. It creates a new copy. It doesn't just append to the list. And so I'm able to add this scaffolding, this metaphor, that I'm able to both show how it's similar and different, and that makes it easy to learn. And this is not in my test. It doesn't belong in my test, but it really is helpful for people to learn how to use something. So that's just a little difference, but it's a little difference between the test and the documentation. Let's go a little bit bigger. This has also been making me write different tests. So here's some code and pipelines that I've been developing with Jay, and you'll notice some things right away that are not going to show up in your documentation, right? I mean, we got an image. You're never going to have image in your code. We also have this interesting but why section, which talks about motivation. This is something that does not seem obvious that you would want to do it. So here is sort of some reasons you might want to. And what is it that you want to do? Well, you could refactor this single line to these 5 lines. Now, this is a refactoring tool, so it's obvious to me that this is the case. And in fact, as I've been learning how to do this particular pattern, this is all we've been thinking about. But somehow, when we went to writing a utility to help us do it, I seem to have forgotten it. When I wrote the documentation, it came right back. And in fact, when I went to write the documentation, I needed to write this code snippets. And so here I am in my code, and here are the 2 code snippets. And these 2 things should produce the same thing, and that is an excellent detection for a property-based test. So after creating these 2 things, I then call them with 100 examples to test that for all 100 of these, they work well. And this is an excellent way to write these tests. Here's what the pipeline version should do. Here's what the straightforward version should do. Check that they do the same thing. So I'm writing better tests because I'm thinking about how people are going to learn to use the code. But that's not all. I'm also writing different code. So this came from the C++, and we're writing something called front-loaded reporters. Now, front-loaded reporters is sort of a feature that approval test needs, but not something I ever expect a user to use. It's something that I need to use so the code just works. But nonetheless, I'm documenting it because we're into this whole documentation as part of our definition of done. And so we need an example. And this example is a little bit hard to write. I have to stretch a little bit. In fact, I need to write this thing called a blocking reporter, which is sort of, it's not like a really useful class. It's a class that I needed for my example. It's sort of like a hello world helper almost. But of course, because I'm writing this helper, I now need to document it. So I have to write documentation about the blocking reporter. And as I'm doing that, we have to start thinking about, well, why would anyone want to use this? And well, maybe they don't want to use it. This is just sort of a stepping stone to help you write hello world. But of course, my mind doesn't like that. So it sort of like goes, well, you could use it. You could use it if you didn't want tests to run anywhere except one special machine. Now that wouldn't block the reporting, it would block the running. So I had to write some documentation around that. But notice I didn't use blocking reporters, now I'm using machine blockers. And that's because the moment I went to write this code, and this is the thing that has been really impactful for me, I had to write this code and it looked ugly in C++. In fact, a lot of times when I'm writing the documentation, I find myself having to explain or justify why my code kind of sucks a little bit in ways that I don't have to do in TDD. In TDD, I just have to show that my code works. But here, when I had to show that it sucked a little bit and sort of document around that, I don't want to do that. Instead, I fix the code so I don't have to explain that it sucks. And so in this case, I pulled out machine blockers, and that actually made machine blockers better and more usable, but also made blocking reporters more usable, because now blocking reporters takes a blocking mechanism. And so you can actually extend this in very useful ways. And in the end, I have better code because I've been using my empathy to think about how people are going to learn to use this code. So that's the big part, right? I've now made this shift from how people use the code to also include how people learn the code. I've only been doing this for 2 months, and it's made a fairly big impact on the way I develop. But I want to talk to more people about their experiences, and unfortunately there aren't very many people to talk to, because very few people are actually doing this. There's a couple caveats that I should put into this. One is I am creating open source projects here. So the very nature of the product is also API that developers will read. That obviously impacts the usefulness of these documents. I don't know how this works if what I was producing is just an internal app that nobody would see the code other than my fellow teammates or maybe fellow people in my company. I assume it would change something because a big part of writing the documentation is looking through the eyes of the people who are going to read the documentation. And then also, if any of this was interesting to you, I wanted to just take a moment to explore Markdown snippets because that's been really useful for me. So here's Markdown snippets, and you can find it on GitHub. It's really, really easy to install. The way that I do it almost all the time is through NuGet. So I run this tool, and then to use it, I simply run MD snippets. What it does is it allows in my thing to have these little sections of code. And in fact, you'll also see this snippet source. If you click on it, it will take you to the part of the code where it is. And you can see here, start code, verify, end code. And verify list, that is what's showing up here. But it doesn't actually show up here. If I go back to the directory folder in my docs, you'll see that I have a subfolder called MD source. And if I go into MD source, you'll see all these files that have like toString.source.md. And if I go into that, you'll see here where I actually have the list section, it just says snippet verify list. That verify list, it searches through all my files to find that comment and grabs it and inserts it. You'll also notice that underneath it, I am inserting an entire file. So snippet include this file, which also fits really nicely for things like approval tests. So that's the entire of MD snippets. I have found it incredibly useful. If this documentation thing is interesting to you, I would encourage you to check it out as well. And that's everything. As I said, I'm Llewellyn Falco. I'm an Agile coach. Thank you for sitting here and thinking about documentation with me. If you start doing this, if you start getting insights, please connect with me, share. I want to figure out how to do this better, and I'm just starting out my journey. Happy coding.